Hi guys, I'm Brett Manning, trustee of the new Aussie Constitution Trust. Today I want to talk about a new model that's been released by the Australian Republican movement to elect a head of state. Let me say first that I support the efforts of the Australian Republican movement, but in developing the new Aussie Constitution, I felt it was important to address all the possible opportunities for change if we're going to look at reinventing the Constitution. So rather than going for an amendment in relation to the head of state only, I think it's an opportunity for us to review the entire Constitution. And that's what brought about the new Aussie Constitution. Now, the Australian Republican movement have released in the last few days a new model for the election of an Australian head of state. Now, that's something that absolutely is supported under the new Aussie Constitution, and what I wanted to look at was the differences between the model that the Australian Republican movement has put forward and the model that appears in the new Aussie Constitution. Now, we need to recognise that the Australian Republican movement have canvassed a lot of Australians to come up with their model and received advice from a lot of different quarters. And that's certainly a good way to develop a model. But one of the reasons why I looked at developing the new Aussie Constitution as opposed to just joining the Australian Republican movement is that I believe that the new Constitution needs to be drafted outside of political spectrum. Now, within the Australian Republican movement, there are obviously some former or current political members, whether they be members of political parties or people who have actually run for office or have actually held office previously. Now, my concern when you approach a range of people that includes a number of ex-political people, what you start to do is you start to get the influence of the parliaments on the way the Constitution is drafted. And I think this is highlighted in the slight differences between the new Aussie Constitution's model for electing the head of state and the model that's been developed by the Australian Republican movement. So under the Australian Republican movement model, I understand that they have 3 candidates proposed by the Parliament, the Commonwealth Parliament, and they have 1 candidate proposed by each of the state parliaments, state and territory parliaments. So they come up with a pool of about 11. The new Aussie Constitution has a voting pool of 10. There's not much difference there. But 8 of those 11 under the Australian Republican movement model come from election from the parliaments or in each of the states and territories. Now, the problem with this is they're obviously going to recommend, if they've only got 1 candidate they can put forward, they're going to pick somebody from their state who is, they think, would make a good Governor General, or maybe it's President with the Australian Republican movement, it's unclear. But for the head of state, that person, they would be recommending somebody in their state, from their state. Now, you can imagine that, take Western Australia for example, some leading West Australian person is recommended by the West Australian Parliament be put forward. Chances are, in many cases, that leading person will not be known at all throughout the rest of the country. And as Western Australia only has 10% of the population, the chance of that person ever being elected are fairly low. So I think we need to look nationally when we look to put candidates forward, people that will be known by the whole country. Sometimes that could be somebody that a state would put forward, but quite often who a state would put forward is perhaps not relevant to the rest of the country. Might be a great candidate, but we've got to think nationally. And so with the new Aussie Constitution, we have 5 members nominated by the Commonwealth Parliament. And having 5 instead of 3 gives more scope for people that are not all elected or nominated by the government that's running the country at the time. So if you've only got 3 candidates, chances are whichever party's in power, two out of 3 of those, or possibly 3 out of 3, are going to be people that are in favour with that party. If you've got 5 nominations from the Commonwealth Parliament, the chances are that it will also include within the 5 people who may be in favour with the opposition, or people that are more generally respected within the community. So I think increasing the number from 3 to 5 from the Commonwealth Parliament makes sense. And in the new Aussie Constitution, the other 5 are nominated by the people. So it's a direct nomination online from the people, and the highest nominations from across the country go through to become the other 5 from which we get to choose to elect the head of state. By doing that, you're thinking nationally, okay? Because if somebody's going to get into that second 5 group, elected, nominated by the people, they're going to be well known right across the country. They are going to be leaders from right across the country. And so we've got the best balance, I believe, under the new Aussie Constitution. 5 from the Commonwealth Parliament, 5 nominated by the people, and then the people go to election and they choose. With the Australian Republican movement model, it means that we have influence from state politicians in the development of the model. And so they put the hand up and say, obviously the state should have a chance to nominate somebody if the Commonwealth gets a chance to nominate somebody. And so we end up with this system of 3 nominated by the Commonwealth, 7 or 8, 9, depending who gets a vote, from the states and territories. Okay, but not from the Australian people. Australian people still don't get a chance to nominate who they think might be best. I really can't see where giving state governments a chance to nominate an individual to put up for Commonwealth election to head of state really adds any value to the process. If they're getting to put up a single candidate from their state, the chances are that candidate's going to be reasonably closely aligned to the government that happens to be in power in that particular state at that particular time. I think we're far better off relying on the people themselves to nominate some candidates that the politicians might not necessarily put up. So we're always relying on the politicians to decide who they think should be the head of state. And politicians are going to select a different group of people than what the public would, I would suggest. And so while I would support the Australian Republican movement model as superior to what we currently have on the current constitution, where we have a foreign head of state, I think the model that we have in the new Aussie Constitution is superior because it has more input from the Australian people, and it also gives more flexibility to the Commonwealth Parliament for selecting their nominations. And you're more likely to get balance from those five, and also non-political selections from the Australian people. They're potentially non-political. Australian people might nominate ex-politicians or political leaders, and that's fine. It's up to the Australian people to decide that. Thanks for your time.